Hello, everybody. Welcome to Good Tech, an ongoing discussion of ethics and technology. I'm Elizabeth Perry with Idka, and today we're celebrating a birthday. It's actually not happening until Saturday, but on May 25th of last year, GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation here in Europe, went into effect, making it mandatory for all companies processing the data of EU citizens to comply with the regulation or else face hefty fines. That means no matter where you are, if you are an online shop, publication, or any organization of any size dealing with EU data, you have to comply. Last week, we spoke with Mitch Ratcliffe, veteran expert on privacy and technology, about the evolution of privacy from the early days of the well to now, into a movement to protect our privacy as a human right. We called it The Awakening. If you missed last week's show, you can still listen on ubngo.com/goodtech or view on Idka's YouTube channel. Also, if you have any questions during today's show, dial the number on your screen and we'll do our best to answer your questions. So today we're going to continue the discussion on privacy, but we're going to start with GDPR. How is it affected how will it affect businesses worldwide? It's my pleasure to welcome today's guest, journalist, author, editor, serial entrepreneur, Mitch Ratcliffe.
Hello. Thanks for having me, and what a spectacular
What a spectacular what?
audience. I don't know how you get them in your bedroom like that.
They're awesome. They're awesome, aren't they? So Mitch, welcome. Thanks so much again for joining us. We've talked about GDPR a lot on recent shows, and it's in the news a great deal with the likes of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal. That seemed to be the start of it all, and other big tech players, the data breaches, the mistrust, the collective shelling out of billions and fines. And what does it all mean? Maybe just a short description of what actually does GDPR mean?
Well, GDPR means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but then there's what it really legally means, and that is that a citizen of the EU or of the extended EU economic zone has a right to control their data, essentially. That is, they have a right to determine how it can be used, to have the disclosure of any intended uses by the person or entity collecting the information, and the ability to opt in or opt out to that use before it starts. So if I say I'm going to sell this information to another company, I have to tell you that, and you get the opportunity as a citizen of the EU to say, no, I won't let you do that. Now, of course, that means I might say, well, then we can't do business, but the intention of the law is to make it easier to do business based on a set of clearly understood guidelines for how personal data is managed. And the benefit, we shouldn't forget the benefit to companies, which is that they no longer have to deal with, in the EU, 14 to 20 different national laws. They have to deal with one law. And unlike the United States, where privacy has never really been a major issue, Europe has a long history of persecutions based on well-managed books. In other words, they keep good track of their citizens, what their citizens are doing. It has allowed them to, in some very unfortunate cases, give armies or persecutors access to information about everyone. When the Nazis took over a community during World War II, they went right to City Hall and they took the records. And so European countries had very strong data privacy laws, and each country had their own. This dates well back before the computer era, in fact, because of that experience. And GDPR unifies this one large market of about 350 million to 400 million consumers under one privacy regime. And so it's a pretty darn good thing from the perspective of a company trying to figure out how to interact with a large group, a large audience. But it is, of course, only a European law, but it's a European law with teeth that can reach global violators. And
so how does it affect US and beyond?
Well, technically, if you're doing business through a website which is located in the EU, any part of the EU, and within any particular country in the EU, you should be storing that data in that country and not moving it across national borders. So if I'm an American company or a global brand who's working in Europe in any way, I should have a data center within the country that is the home or residence of the person with whom I'm dealing, and the data should be stored there. If it's moved out of the country, my company is potentially liable. Additionally, I need to live by the rules of the user has to opt in to the sharing of their data. I have to alert them if I've decided to use their data differently and give them the opportunity to opt out. And they have the right to be forgotten. In other words, they have the right to ask you to remove the information. Although there are, and this is why the law is potentially good for all of the brands out there, rules about when the erasure of my information would actually harm them. And so there are limits on what can be erased as well. I've talked to dozens and dozens of brands about GDPR. Half of them take it seriously and want to comply by these rules, and half of them completely ignore them. And the ones who completely ignore them face very serious consequences. So if you're a small company and you break the law, and there's two tiers of breaking the GDPR, which I really can't say that are easy to explain. But if you do a small violation, you can be fined up to $10 million or 10 million euros a year until you fix this, or a percentage, 4%, 2% of your total revenue. So if you're a small company doing $10 million a year and you violate GDPR, you're liable for a 2 million euro fine. If you are a major violator of GDPR, you can be fined up to 20 million euros or 4% of your revenue. Now, there's a new concrete example of this in Ireland. Yesterday, Ireland filed a GDPR complaint initiated a GDPR complaint against Google. And Google, if they are found guilty of violating Irish citizens' data rights, is liable for $5.4 billion in a year in fines. That's real money, and it should make a company like Google sit up and really take notice and think and rethink this. And as we talked about on the last conversation, I think marketers now are at a point where they need to treat the information they get from a consumer like they would somebody that they like the information they would get from a business associate or a friend. And not simply disclose it or use it as a commodity that they can remonetize. Marketers are making the mistake of thinking that gathering that information and then reaping the value of the information rather than providing a customer experience based on that information is the right way to go. And that's not the right way to go. We're ending up turning one another into objects or commodities in and of ourselves. And people are starting to fight back against that. GDPR was an early example of that, but you're seeing this in the United States in growing concern about the nature of our privacy. Although in many cases in the States, I think it's conflated with a concern about free speech. And that's where we get into some strange American habits.
Isn't it true though that, I mean, the reality of it, it sounds so serious and everything. But the companies I know that are in the US, I mean, even like media companies, even like large publications, they're not GDPR compliant because all they do is say, hey, if you want to continue on this site, you have to agree to our privacy policy.
Well, Yeah, and in American law gives them some leeway in what that exactly means. However, if they're dealing with a citizen of the EU has asserted the authority to mediate that relationship, and they have to pay attention to it, or they're going to fall afoul of European regulators. Uh,
Right.
so my this goes back to what I was talking about last week about, we're being strip mined the way that the planet was strip mined to create the industrial age. Our personal data is being strip mined to create this environment of free services. And I know lots of people who are doing it who think they are doing nothing but good. The problem is, and this is why, for instance, Google is being investigated in Europe. When the argument in Ireland is making is that every time they place an ad, they're offering to a programmatic marketplace a whole lot of information, allowing a brand to target a particular consumer or a particular demographic or psychographic, which is the consumer, to hundreds of thousands of companies around the world who can bid on that opportunity to talk to me. Mm-hmm. And that's unabashed exploitation of my personal data. And that is what the GDPR is designed to stop. We have in the United States a growing discussion about privacy law, but right now I don't see anybody, although Microsoft has started to take some steps in the direction of saying it really does matter. But most companies are aligning against further regulation. But of course, we all know right now that Silicon Valley that both the right and the left are sharpening their knives to regulate Silicon Valley.
I mean, right now it seems like there's kind of an anecdote, but a friend of mine ran into a lawyer, an ex-Facebook lawyer. And I mean, the long and short of it was that they factor in the costs of the fines instead of being, proactive about being compliant. And that has to stop, and that's going to stop, right? Don't you think? I mean,
well, GDPR is only 1 year old. The Irish action is really the first major action to be taken under GDPR. So, yeah, they can plan all day long, and lawyers can say, "Oh, we can avoid these fees or these fines to this degree," and eventually they're going to be wrong, and the finances of those companies will suffer tremendously because, look, that $5.4 billion for Google is just for Ireland. What if Italy, Germany, and Sweden all go in together too? Now you're talking about $15 billion a year in revenue.
Right. Insane.
Various ways of within those countries. And that's the real challenge here is how much revenue do you have in a country? If you're going to do business there, you have to play by the rules. That's something I think we all understand.
So, going back to the sort of in the US, how we're not as privacy focused as, for obvious reasons, the war, whatever. But isn't the US following suit? I mean, what about this California Consumer Privacy Act?
Well, they are, parts of California are following suit, just as parts of the United States are following suit, just as we have done in the past. We have 50 different laboratories of democracy. And California, being the 6th largest economy in the world, has outsized influence compared to every other state in the United States, except perhaps New York. But New York is not as progressive as California. So California's privacy law is probably the model on which U.S. privacy law will be built. However, we have to look carefully at the influence of Silicon Valley companies on that law, because, of course, Silicon Valley's economic future is largely tied to the success of those companies. And so we need to look at this as a good basis for discussion about what we can do on a national basis, national rule, like we did with seatbelts. Right. So the first seatbelt laws started in California. The first emissions control laws started in California. And as a result, all cars made for the United States have to comply with those laws, simply because they want to be able to sell in California. we just have to look in terms of are they cutting corners with regard to our privacy or the privacy of California citizens that may lead to all of us losing some privacy as well.
And so here's the question that actually one of the audience members was too shy to call in. There's a new U.S. law, well, it's not really new, that forces U.S. companies to hand out personal information about people on request from a government organization, regardless of where in the world the data is stored. How will this impact U.S. tech companies?
Well, so first off, there's a recognized obligation for companies to provide support to law enforcement under certain well-defined circumstances. So there has to be a court order, a judge has to have reviewed and signed off on the request, and depending on how the data is stored, it may or may not be accessible even then. The examples that we can look at, and Apple does a good job of this, they will not decrypt a phone for federal law enforcement. They just won't help. On the other hand, if federal law enforcement were to ask them for interaction records with, let's say they used an app, they downloaded an app intended for use by terrorists, that's the kind of information that many companies would hand over quite easily. Because it's a well-defined question. Did somebody get this app? This is maybe a little bit of a long answer to this question, but the problem is we don't really have laws to deal with the new mode of communication that we use. And you can go back to how federal wiretap laws developed after the introduction of the telephone to see similar situations where it was initially very easy, because nobody had paid attention to telecommunications as a legal privacy issue, for law enforcement to just tap your phone. And then we put in place a whole lot of procedures for getting permission to tap a phone. And we continue to try to evolve that as we add mobile devices, as we add IoT that may be interacting with us and capturing data. But what we're doing is simply we're doing the normal thing, which is the long, slow adaptation of our law, which has to be settled and a firm basis for doing business and living as a citizen. So it's slow. We're slowly adapting to these new technologies. And this also comes down to one of the things that we've been talking about is, why would consumers care? When we talk about the particular laws about accessing information about potentially criminal activity, a lot of people then write off, in response to thinking about that, their commercial obligations and rights to their personal data, because they say, I don't do anything wrong. I'm not worried whether or not the police are going to be able to tap my phone. And in fact, I know I bought an iPhone, so it's going to be even harder for them to do it. But those phones are still capturing all of this personal data that's being used in commercial transactions, and much of it beyond our control, that we need to separate these two things. We are both consumers and citizens, but a lot of folks think only in terms of their consumer exposure to surveillance. And it's both a citizen's right to have a certain level of privacy in some countries, not in China,
right,
and not in many others. But in the United States and Europe, we have a tradition of individual freedom, freedom of thought. The idea that I could write something in an electronic journal that could somehow implicate me in thought crimes is not out of the range of possibility today, because I could have my journal read by a law enforcement agency or by a company who says, geez, Mitch is feeling X, let's give him Z. And in both cases, I'm losing something. I'm losing my freedom of thought vis-a-vis the government, and I'm losing my right not to be manipulated without my knowledge in my commercial interactions.
Yeah. So from here, we could go a number of different ways. I mean, you touched on one of the questions I was going to ask you, or I want to talk about, is that I don't care answer, and what we were talking about before we got on the air.
Mhm.
I mean, let's face it, it's incredibly difficult to pry the average user off of free.
And free is the lead, what everybody leads with. But free services come with a lot of costs that are not acknowledged. And all GDPR does is say you have to acknowledge those costs. And you have to establish a contract that says that we're going to behave in certain ways. It's the loosey-goosey Wild West, like we talked about last week, right?
Yeah.
Our digital environment is less than 50 years old. It's really less than 30 years old in terms of how most of us experience it. And so we haven't got the laws, the rules, the mores that we need for this new environment. And you know, if you go back and read Marshall McLuhan, who was a theorist of media back in the 60s, he talked about the emergence of a global village. And a lot of people have focused on that as an idea of, oh, we're all connected and we're going to be able to collaborate and work together. And that drove a lot of the initial idealistic aspirations for the net. But what McLuhan really meant was that all of a sudden the whole world would be present close to you because of media, and it would be overwhelming. The other idea that people are really familiar with is future shock, which Alvin Toffler and Heidi Toffler, a term they coined in 1970, about just so much happening so fast that you couldn't deal with it anymore. McLuhan's warning was that you're going to be overwhelmed by the fact that you suddenly know in real time what's going on the other side of the world, not just in your neighborhood. And so we're wrestling with this overwhelming amount of information that we have to deal with, and an extraordinary amount of what we would call information exhaust that we're throwing off that companies are harvesting in order to understand how to interact with us better. And so I think we're in a lot of ways we're headed into what we would describe as the progressive era of the 21st century. And in the Teddy Roosevelt sense, where we are going to go after monopolies of information, we're going to go after monopolies of connectivity. That's the primary concern from the right, is this notion of limited free speech. It's often used to defend hate speech, which, when you go to Europe, there are clear laws against hate speech that we are trying not to put in place here. And I think, again, this is going to be a contest between Europe and American values as it becomes a part of the legal canon. But we just haven't had enough cases or enough interactions yet, despite the billions and trillions of interactions that we'd have every year, to have arrived at a new legal regime that we can all understand and use confidently.
Yeah, and that kind of, I'm skipping around a little bit, but that kind of brings me to, what if we have a UN for privacy? Can we do that, or is it too hard because China and they require that you have me or WeChat?
Well, yeah, but then there's a whole bunch of people are going, world government is not the answer.
What's the answer then, Mitch? Come on, this is why you're
supposed to. The reason that I can say that any of this is because I know I might be wrong. If I tell you what's going to happen, I'm an idiot. And no one can tell you exactly what's going to happen. Look, the UN is an organization that could start to work on these things, but they can only provide guidance for all intents and purposes to national governments. They may sign on or they may not sign on. And look at the Paris Climate Accords. Everybody in the world signed on except for us. And so there's always going to be this concern about whether or not our national identity is intact when you talk about something like a UN for privacy. And they do, they have addressed the implications of privacy in many things, but I don't know that we are in the United States prepared to have that conversation. About 30% of our population right now thinks that any form of transnational cooperation is a disadvantage to the United States. So how do you overcome that? And the strategy on that wing of our political debate has been to disrupt any discussion by trolling and by fake news and other things. to prevent a rational conversation about how we might proceed as a society. On the other side, I think you've got a lot of people on the left who, seeking to empower the individual, have in many cases created both unexpected or unanticipated collective powers that particularly governments and corporations can exploit. But they've also isolated individuals to such an extent that they can't have these conversations because they are no longer aware, like I said earlier, of the difference between there being a consumer and there being a citizen. Citizenship is about a set of rights and limits on how the government can behave toward you. Consumerism, or being a consumer, is an ongoing dialogue about what I'm willing to give in exchange for what I get. And as we know, everything on the web seems to be free because it's being built on this data exhaust that we've never really thought of as value. And we have to start to recognize it as value and negotiate based on that.
Yeah. I mean, so we could go either way. Well, here's an interesting quote from one of our founders.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know what you think of this. Bjorn Stormarken is our CFO and co-founder, and he's done quite a bit of work with Amnesty International and human rights, and he's just got a long resume. And he says about GDPR, however, much more is needed. We need to look at radical concepts in order to dig ourselves out of the deep hole we are in fact in. We need to look at mandatory end-to-end encryption, prohibition of default sharing, mandatory provision of any service on a subscription basis where no information is collected and used at all, and not the least, the prohibition of trading in sensitive personal data as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So
I mean, that's a good idea, but who's gonna enforce it, right? I mean,
well, we can break it down though. There are agencies and entities as well as watchdog organizations that could address each part of this. And going backwards from starting with the prohibition on trading personal information, GDPR is the beginning of that regulatory regime, and that could also be implemented as. Although it has never been particularly successful, I think in the long run, self-regulatory practices, best practices for doing business using personal data. But laws seem to carry a lot more weight than industry guidelines. So that's one that we already are starting to address. Now, the prohibition on default sharing and the nature of the interaction or the contract that you set up when you start to use a free service or a paid service on the internet is going to be case law. It's not going to be a regulatory regime. So what we'll need to do is have many lawsuits, for lack of a better way of putting it, that will work this out. And that's going to take 10 to 15 years. Then we will have a basis in case law for deciding how to deal with this environment. It's exactly like I was saying about the transition from no telephones to telephones 100 years ago. We found a lot of ways to control how we act toward one another. A lot of people don't recall this, but most phone lines were party lines. Mm-hmm. So you could pick up the phone and listen to your neighbors talk. I can remember doing that in the 1960s, and I still can't. Just the idea that I could pick up the phone and I could hear a conversation without even having to say I was there. Because people, and I had an aunt who used to do this. She was really good at picking up the phone quietly so she could listen to the neighbors. But then we got past that. We got past that not because of there were some lawsuits about privacy in community lines, but we got past it because people got tired of being listened to, and they changed their requirements as customers of our monopoly, AT&T, who went to dedicated lines. Now we've gone from shared lines in digital, like we have on cable networks, right? So we all use the data on the cable drop and share it, unless we buy a dedicated endpoint in which case they create a tunnel and they address us. A lot of this is so transparent to us that we don't think about who's touching our data as it's traveling between two places. And that's where we're in the midst of an evolutionary phase. And then going to the end-to-end encryption, that probably is something that has to come from a legal requirement and from a regulatory requirement, if in fact it's ever going to happen. It isn't clear to me that we could ever force anybody to encrypt their content if they didn't want to. Now, you might provide it as a convenience, and then Idka makes it very easy to use end-to-end encryption, but that's always going to be my choice. It's, this is not like driving a car. I can force somebody to drive 55 miles an hour or whatever the local speed limit is, but they can choose to do it, and if they do it, they go on without being fined. If they choose not to do it, then they run the risk of being fined. But they aren't going to be fined because we don't have a way of tracking that consistently yet. And I think most people will resist being given speeding tickets based on what their car tells the police. I think you would describe that as private data too. That may just be my preference because I like to drive fast. But but I just think that is going to be a mores issue, and it'd be something where I would say, Liz, I want to have a conversation, but we have to do it with encryption.
Right.
That's it's the inverse of the opting in to having my data shared too. So these are complementary social and business practices transformations that we're going through right now. And as I've said, I think, and obviously Idka agrees with this in terms of the structure of the services that it has created, that people have the right to use as private a means as they want. And in the long term, my feeling is that we will not be entirely private, but we will be sharing information selectively under fairly transparent agreements that allow us to audit whether or not the things that we committed to give away and the things that we agreed we were going to get in exchange are actually delivered. So transparency, and this goes to the question of sustainability that I mentioned last week too, will be an important part of how we coordinate our shared activities, but it won't necessarily be the law. It'll be a continuing fluid set of relationships that we are either going to make more personal or more impersonal. More personal means it's about value to the two parties in the transaction, not 10,000 other companies. And that's something that we're going to come to slowly because we are very, very stubborn monkeys.
And we're still married to free. I mean, even after this conversation, the audience probably, they're going to go right back to their free.
And they're watching on YouTube.
And they're watching on YouTube, which is, yeah.
So they didn't go back. They're free now.
So, but let me ask you, because up until now, this conversation has been pretty positive. I mean, you're what you're saying, what you seem to be saying is that eventually we'll get it. Eventually people will get how important data is and how they should be treating it like their property or right? But the opposite could happen.
Yes. And in some countries like China, where they are using massive surveillance in order to control their society and to ends that their society seems to agree with in many cases, an increased sense of security, that is a viable alternative and may ultimately predominate across much of the world. The question is, are we going to continue to be us with the respect that we have had for one another? And in the United States, there's probably some fear of one another too, that is not allowed into many other societies. And what we're really looking at right now is probably 2 or 3 major regimes of information contending for dominance in the world. The European approach, which the United States only partially endorses, and frighteningly may share more in common with some of the Chinese thinking at this point, is one of the, so Europe's one, and Europe and the United States is a traditional bloc. It doesn't seem as solid as normal, but that would be the freedom and individuality bloc. The Chinese and Russians represent a total control environment where it's either explicit, where the Chinese government owns everything, or it's implicit, where the Russian hierarchy owns the media and uses the media on behalf of the government because they're in business together. And then there's the rest of the world that has varying degrees of a sense of privacy, and in some cases are well ahead of us in terms of their infrastructure. I mean, Africa, for instance, is going to be fascinating because everybody has a mobile phone. Now, they didn't have PCs, and the physical artifact of the PC, which has all our stuff in it, is not part of their thinking about it. Everything's on the cloud in Africa. What will that mean to the way they think about what their information rights are is yet to be seen.
Wow. Yeah, talk about the way it is in the rest of the world. We always talk about Europe and the US, and you just talked about Africa. I mean,
Well,
people don't realize that, like, this means there can't necessarily be a global oversight organization for privacy because there isn't enough of a common ground.
that's history, right? That's just how we are. We come up with different ideas and we try them out, and eventually they either become widely accepted or not. I think that global approach actually will be catalyzed by our eventual recognition that there is no boundary involved in global warming.
Right.
You can't fight climate change just at home. You have to work with other people around the world, and there are some trade-offs involved, and that's just like our trade-off discussion in personal data. So we're probably 50 to 100 years from a time in which that would be a comfortable idea globally. And that'll be because we have moved from struggling between our national and regional differences and focused on the fact that if the planet is going to thrive, the planet has to do that together, people and nature. A lot of people forget we're part of nature. They talk about nature coming after us. Well, no, it's nature responding to us, and we're coming after ourselves unless we decide to change. And that's true in personal privacy too. We can give it all away and hope for the best. We can hold it all close and hope for the best, but some middle ground is going to be where that actually happens.
So, yeah, and then another question from last week, it's a good time to get into this, is how are privacy and sustainability linked? And you talked about it, you touched on it, but I want to know more. I mean, I want to really understand what you mean by that.
Well, first off, let's remember that we are on the verge of the introduction of 5G connectivity and widespread implementation of the Internet of Things. We've been talking about it now for 5 years, but the first real wave is the tsunami is coming with IoT, because 5G allows you to connect 1.25 million devices in every kilometer. And that means that we could literally have an IoT device every few inches at minimum. In that environment, you can track a lot of different activities, what's coming in and out of your house, and so let's think about from the consumer or from the business perspective. If I can plan to deliver a predictable amount of my product or service based on a commitment by consumers who share the values that I have articulated for the delivery of those services. They're not going to be bad for the environment. There's going to be no slavery involved. There's transparency so that I know that I'm getting what I want. There's the ability to audit, to be able to say that I know that when I say I want things recycled, they really are recycled. But we could do a lot of this on automatic based on our preferences using technology. And that means we have to find some way to set to create settings that allow us to quickly say, okay, this company conforms with what I want in a food service, right? It's locally grown, and so I've said I want locally grown stuff. That's my personal information. They say, well, we make locally grown, so we're going to give you locally grown. Great. I also want it to be organic. Okay. Well, now they say we're going to do organic. We have 2 degrees of personal information involved in the contract between us. And finally, if you do it right, I say, I want to buy it every week or every 2 weeks, or in the case of a television, I want to buy it every 18 months or 36 months, however frequently we want to. And certainly in sustainability, one of the things we should be doing is trying not to buy so much all the time, unless it's 100% recycled and completely carbon neutral, which we are not at yet. There are some companies that are carbon neutral, and they're examples of where business is going. But I can subscribe, that is, establish a long-term business relationship or a contract to continue to purchase this as long as they fulfill the requirements I'm looking for. It's net carbon zero, it's good for people, it's good for me, it's good for my community, not just the multinational corporation. So we can use our personal data in that environment to optimize the delivery of the services and the products we want. Mm-hmm. But that means how much sharing? We don't know yet. That means that the brands who initially sign up with us, who later on say, well, we're making $120 a year in profit on Mitch, but if we were to take his data and sell it, we'd be making $260 a year in profit on Mitch. I don't want that to happen. And I would say, stop my subscription, because I'm no longer going to tell you what I'm going to want in the future, because you're not respecting my privacy. And I'll be able to tell, because suddenly I'll be getting all these ads for what I already buy from them, from somebody else. And so in some sense, the marketers also invited the competition into their relationship with me. So it's bad for them, but that's often put aside just for the revenue from selling the data. So sustainability is about a strategic sharing of information to achieve goals, carbon and water usage goals, supply chain transparency, and a lot of other things that without our personal data have no meaning. And conversely, the brand's information has no meaning without the ability to tie it back to us, because they're planning on purchasing, building, and delivering product on a very well-defined demand model based on how many people subscribe. So as we talk about subscription everything, what we're really talking about is a relationship that allows us to define how we want that service or good to come into our lives and then back out of our lives with accountability. And accountability comes from the sharing of data. So it's an opportunity for us to do a lot of great things for the planet and for one another that may or may not immediately feel like a benefit to us. But as long as we're doing it based on our articulated values and the commitment by the company to live by those values, we can agree to plan together the next 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, or further purchasing. I mean, if I buy a car today, I wouldn't buy a car today. I would subscribe to a car. And I would have it taken back after 5 years, not 3, not 2, which is 3 is the standard replacement pace traditionally in the United States of cars. But if we were to say 5 years, and they're going to service it the whole time, so it's also going to perform better and be less environmentally impactful during that time. And again, that's a transaction that I will have built into the lease or subscription agreement. We're talking about an immensely more efficient economy, and one in which we're not constantly changing our minds because we've committed to certain things.
So you're saying, okay, so here's a question that just came in, and this is probably some of this has been answered, but sure. We talk about the economy, billions of dollars of corporate wealth has been created since the birth of the internet and the business models that have evolved. So we've made billions of dollars off data, right? I mean,
Trillions.
Okay, trillions. And I mean, that's like, actually, that's just one company. I mean, but with so much at stake, how can we move beyond what Shoshana Zuboff is calling surveillance capitalism? I mean, you're talking about sustainability and all this stuff, but isn't that still like, I mean, if we talk about it with sustainability, if we get people to pay attention to sustainability as something that is like earth-shatteringly important, then maybe we can link it to privacy.
I think we can. So what we're really talking about here is coordination, and it takes information to do coordination. So first off, yeah, billions of dollars have been made by Google, for instance, or Facebook, or Apple, or Microsoft, and the list goes on. Netflix is another one. Some of that money was earned for the delivery of valuable services, and some of that money was earned on what you would describe as a traditional externality, something you don't pay for. And in the physical economy, we never actually talked about the cost of extraction of iron ore, lead, anything from the earth. There was the cost of taking it out, but not the cost to the earth or to future generations or to the environment when carbon dioxide or pollutants were released into the environment. So those externalities, those old ones, which we now recognize are not external to our whole system because it's contributing to weather change and all sorts of stuff. We're doing the same, as I said earlier, we're strip mining one another for this personal information. It's going to have consequences which we are not currently accounting for in these transactions. And that's where accountability and transparency allows you to understand those things and really come to a fair, equitable exchange. Now, what's a fair, equitable exchange? I don't deny somebody the right to make billions of dollars based on their ability to deliver value. But if they're delivering that value without disclosing the fact that they're treating me or the environment or my community unfairly in other ways, then it's not a perfect market. So the market can't operate correctly, and that undercuts the market will solve everything argument. It's a non-argument. That's a statement of faith, and we don't need faith. We need clarity, transparency, something approximating a scientific understanding of how things are changing. And so yeah, billions of dollars have been created, and they were created out of thin air, which actually turns out to be out of us. And now we're looking at whether that's really fair or not. And so the conversation is going to change, and it is in the midst of changing already. Is it fair that Sergey Brin and Larry have made Larry Page have both have $80 billion? Some people will say yes, and some people will say no. But it ultimately comes down to what Google gives me as a service and what I value it at. And if my perception as a consumer continues to change because I know what I'm giving them is worth more than what I'm getting, that will change the transaction in the future too.
Yep, you pretty much got that one, nailed that one.
We do this over and over. A lot of this is simply a reading of history and different same tune but different key, or it's a different tempo, and this is clearly a faster tempo than previously.
Yeah. Well, listen, we have a minute left in our show here.
It always goes so fast.
I know, right? Maybe you'd like to leave the audience with something, a story or something important, a word of advice from a person who's been around the block a few times.
Sage advice is take it all with a grain of salt. And seriously, this is the same question we should be asking Google. I mean, really, why are they doing this? Why would I say what I'm going to say? Doubt, constructive doubt, is the right way for us to proceed as a society. Unless, of course, you're anti-enlightenment, and I can't do anything about that. But I argue that if we test and doubt our way toward greater equity and equality, we will get there. It may take a long time. There are people standing in our way, some of them with guns, and it will be, just as human history has been, full of drama. The question we have to ask ourselves individually is, do we want to be part of the drama, or do we want to stand on the sidelines? I would encourage all of you to be part of the drama.
All right. Well, that's it for today, folks. If you have any questions for Mitch or myself, thanks for those of you who have written in during the show. You can find us on Idka. That's IDKA, www.idka.com. Sign up for a free account and start your own truly private group or organization. And we look forward to seeing you again, Mitch. We're going to have to make you a regular because
well, let's create an
fascinating.
Idka community to have this conversation.
Sounds good. Sounds good. All right, everyone. Have a great evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Peace.
Take care.